And
Yeah.
one of the things that I've been trying to stress over and over is that in every place across Europe, the Wiccan begins with governments passing laws announcing that there is a new crime, witchcraft, and introducing new regulations, introducing new acts of government. This is very important because it's from above that the people are told, watch out, there are these and these people, and they're doing, it's not something that is coming from below. One of the second things that is striking is the difference in class, generally, between the so-called witches and the accusers. So you see there's a class difference. You see that those who are accusing them are usually the people of power in their community, people who had property. You see that it's a persecution that has a very clear-cut class character. And there are different groups of women. There are different groups of women who are basically liable, vulnerable to accusation. It's not one group only. But their common denominator, generally they're poor, they come from the lower classes, and there are certain types of accusations that are very common. Women who are, exercising and, healing practices, they basically, they're midwives or they're curing people with herbs, sometimes with I don't know, charms. But certainly many women had their own garden. They knew the properties of plants. They knew the properties of roots, flowers, and they were the doctors. So these are women who have a certain power. Often they predicted the future. So there is the figure of the healer, and she represents something in the community. And, you have an attack on mutual aid, you have an attack on popular powers.
Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. I'm Eduardo Barca with co-host teacher and socialist Andy Lipson and writing teacher Jessica. We are online at what'sleftpodcast.com. You can find that link to our blog in the episode notes, where we found this episode, or you can always check us out on any of our other platforms. You can also find our personal social media handles as @Don Eduardo Barca and @ZepikeE on Instagram, and just his Twitter handle as @JHomie89. Please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, and share your favorite episode wherever you found this episode. Thank you. Right. So today we continue part 2 of the second installment of a piece written by Marxist and writer Tom from Free Left Future, or Freie Linke Zukunft in German. I apologize for the pronunciation. We did an episode last week where we discussed the first installment of his long essay, an incredible piece of titled Virology as Ideology. And last week we did part 1, and today we'll be doing part 2. Last week, if folks have been following us with this series, was a critique of ruling class pseudoscience, and it was around science and class society. This week we'll be tackling part 2 of that of the 4-part installments: the military, academic, industrial, medical, scientific complex, or MAIMS. So we look forward to the discussion. Tom, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me on again.
Yes, thank you. And maybe, Andy, before we begin, maybe you could share something from last week, or give us some reflections from the episode that we did.
I mean, I think you did a good job introducing where we're kind of moving. Last week, we talked about how science is captured by capitalism, and cannot be, and is not just understood as a mechanism of profit production, but a mechanism of social control for that reason. And today, I think we're going to narrow in on a particular branch of science, one that's been given a lot of credit for increasing the mortality rate of humanity in the last century, and other wonders that it has been given credit for, and is the basis of science being actually the basis of how a pseudoscience has turned into a science in all our minds, and we give it such credit, despite all it's being connected to this rotten thing called capitalism. I'll just say this. So today we're really going to just talk about the medical complex connected to the military and to science and to the government in that regard. So Tom, maybe a starting point is where you started that Article 2, which is could you say a little bit about you first criticized the way the left, the kind of normal critique we have of the medical industry, and go then into like, no, that's only a partial critique. We have to go into a deeper critique. And this led you to that name, MAIMS, that is the title of your part 2. So maybe you could start us off there.
Yeah, so I think that the kind of criticism of industrial or capitalist medical care and science, and again, it gets clumsy kind of even trying to differentiate these because they're so interlinked. But both of these spheres roughly are on the whole criticized by our comrades on the left, mainly in the sense that they defraud consumers by trying to sell things too expensively, right, to profit in various ways, which of course they do, that determines the structure to a significant degree. But there seems to be no sense of the criminal activities that these organizations engage in, even though all of them, right, for instance, as RFK Jr. always notes, all of the major vaccine producers are convicted criminals as corporate persons, right? And yet the assumption is that this kind of almost quaint libertarian fantasy of capital as the lemonade shop, that they're mainly just trying to sell the best products to make the most money. There's no real appreciation, I find, of, in particular, the characteristics of monopoly capitalism, and especially something that I argue in the essay, and that is kind of dovetails with an argument I make in another essay I refer to in the piece, where I've tried to point at the fact that we really need a new language, I think, to understand what has really come of capitalism in the past century, really moving beyond simple monopoly or imperialist capital. And one of the characteristics, features of that is this move beyond even mere monopoly, but that the sellers control the corporate buyers, which are insurance companies determining the prices, or government agencies, right, which are simultaneously supposed to be regulating these organizations, but there's a revolving door between them. There is lots of money. Lots of the regulators literally draw their income from the product. So if the industry is successful, they're drawing more income for the regulators, which means for their salaries and for their resources. And so there's this extremely complex bundle of relations that look so different from this picture of capitalists just trying to produce the best product to sell it, or and of course they do want to sell these things, but yeah, my point is that the critique remains so superficial and so distant from anything like the picture of the real industry that we know to be the case. And so one of my first arguments in this essay was trying to move the critique beyond that really superficial level.
One of the things that you talk about is not just, one of the things that's often talked about is not that just that the medical industry, in terms of it being a monopoly and being a vast monopoly, not just Pfizer having regulatory control, and regulatory capture of FDA, but essentially Pfizer is being part of a network of institutions that operate as this gigantic cartel. and that they don't just monopolize the market, but they monopolize the information about their own product, and that information is information said to the consumer, but also to the people who are like doctors and all those sorts of folks, and that you can understand the institution when you understand it as a monopoly in this way, particularly a monopoly that it is meant for profit. You actually it is better to understand this as a harm institution rather than a help institution, because it will function more effectively it operates as a cartel to produce that. It produces products which need to make people sick so that they can then produce more products, which can then make people feel better from the thing that got them sick, and it's a vicious cycle. I definitely see that going on with COVID, but maybe you should talk more about and the vaccines and myocarditis now and but maybe you can talk more about that.
Yeah, I think, as you're right, the monopoly control goes so beyond, because it also they have the capacity in lots of ways to constitute the market itself and to define the boundaries, right? So, I mean, they have the capacity to a significant degree determine what can be researched and what can't, what is acknowledged as legitimate science or not, and that filters into regulatory procedures in terms of determining what kind of care can be provided and what can't, even so far as to force people to take certain types of medical care or undergo certain types of procedures, and to pathologize them medically or psychologically if they're not. So the control of what kind of medicine, what kind of medical schools, right? We talk about the Flexner report, which famously helped impose this monopoly and Carnegie-backed disciplining of medical institutions in the United States, not coincidentally also ending almost all Black medicine in the United States. Almost all Black medical schools were shut down as a direct consequence of the Flexner report. So, of course, always overlapping these powers of structure. And then there is just it's a point that is often kind of parodied or mocked as a almost high school stoner kind of observation, right? Of course, if they had the cure to cancer, they wouldn't give it to us, or they'd hide it. But there is a core structural truth if we look at this whole institution. Obviously, everything is always a field of struggle, and people pursue their own good health. That is something that everyone is massively incentivized to do. And so the capitalist class is highly constrained in the ways in which they can force these products upon us, and they have to resort to highly sophisticated means. But from the largest picture of abstraction, I do think there's a real truth to the fact that our default assumption shouldn't be that the main way this organization makes its profit is from producing good health. And we know that there are massive disincentives to producing that in the long term. At the very least, it wants to do it under very narrow conditions, and conditions that are constrained by the other interest and interrelations of the class society in which it's taking place.
And I'll just add one more thing, and I do want Jessica and Eduardo to get in, but I feel like I have to say this because in some ways I suffered from this same illusion, and you brought it up in your reading, where this term snake oil and snake oil salesman. So the snake oil salesman has often been attributed to the margins of health. These people who come to your doorstep and say, I can make you better this way, or you see these things on the fringe, and people have this sense of these people are just trying to like make money from me, so I'm going to be skeptical of them. And the entire industry that I'm actually operating in, health industry, like that literally defines it. Like that actual situation defines it. And yet even myself, I think that somehow I never attributed that giant fear I should have to this giant complex. Whereas I look over here on the margins and I'm worried about them. I mean, I personally feel like I've suffered from that, like in terms of that contradiction in my own beliefs. And you just pointed out so well in your article. I just wanted to say that.
Was not one of the early Rockefellers a literal snake oil salesman? I remember, I think it was Corbett in one of his documentaries goes into it. Maybe Tom, you know the backstory, but I'm pretty sure like not even on like a metaphorical level, but I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. So like the John D. Rockefeller, his father, was an actual snake oil salesman. And I mean, there is even the remarkable fact that the whole allopathic edifice that was to a significant degree forced upon us by Rockefeller and Carnegie control of the kind of borders or terms of what is legitimate healthcare. A huge amount of it was structured around finding a profitable market for petroleum-derived pharmaceutical products. And so, in that sense, too, it is an oil market, and that is just not appreciated. And I think, yeah, what Andy says, it's overwhelming how deeply that bias has been imposed on us. And I mean, I think there's an unimaginable amount of funding, and even I think on the left, we also sometimes have the default, strangely enough, of thinking about, even though we should be the last to fall prey to this. It's understandable why right wing or libertarians only think of the government as doing psychological operations, but the sorts of marketing apparata that modern capitalist enterprises control are just as sophisticated and are using just as complex mechanism for controlling the population. They're not just putting lots of money into glossy ads. And I think there's a lot of work that's gone into deeply implanting, in all sorts of, it's coded in the media, it's coded in characters. It's why in Breaking Bad, there has to be this character with an imagined electrosensitivity that is exposed to have been a psychological, that he was just a crazy man who believed it. And that experience is implanted in people's heads, and they really feel like they've experienced the case of a crazy guy who believes he's subjected to, or that he's electrosensitive when it was imagined. But that was fictional itself. That was a fictional character constructed to advance an overall principle that they wanted implanted in us. And I think it's the same, that everyone has this visceral feeling that anyone doing alternative medical care and trying to make a living is somehow a grifter. And there are grifters in that space, but often I've come around to thinking that the people who are transparent about how they're making money from providing a valuable service are much more trustworthy than, for instance, the these supposedly innocent providers who, like the formula providers, who make sure to be the first free information that women receive about how they should breastfeed their children, right? But they seem like some uninterested institution, and that's what should really, I think, raise our suspicions.
Well, I was just going to bring up, I just, one thing that I really appreciated about the article was just the way that you kind of frame this idea of like individual choice, and with the whole sort of alternative health practitioners and grifters. And I agree, like, of course, there are people trying to profit off of that, but I think it's very telling that there even is like this whole industry that's cropped up around like taking care of your health. I mean, like outside of the medical sphere, of like, life coaches and nutrition advice givers, and I don't know, there's like the whole gambit, right? And just like how indicative that is of how much we outsource and how just disembodied everybody is, that like even the people who are seeing, at least some of the issues with the medical industrial complex or with MAIMS, there's still oftentimes this inability to really feel like, oh, I can take like autonomous control over my own health. And that is like, I think on some level, it's sort of illusory, and it's part of this like almost transhumanist like disembodiment. But at the same time, and your article does a great job of highlighting this, of like the material conditions, and cultural, political, like all of these forces that make it impossible for people to actually pursue good health. I mean, even just like the environment in which we live, like you're starting with an uphill battle, like from even like in utero, right? Just with the level of toxins and yeah, like the EMFs is a good example too. So yeah, I was just thinking about sort of this push and pull between like just taking control of your own health, right? Like, which has been a big phrase, I feel like, especially in the past couple of years, of people who are like, just take responsibility, just, say no to that jab, say no, whatever, right? Like, just do yoga and and grow your own food. Yeah, I'll stop there. I guess that wasn't a question, was it?
Yeah, but if I could just expand on your point, I do think it's also one of the many areas where I think we can show that actually, again, it's only socialism and communism that offer a real avenue towards the actual flourishing and actualization of the human individual. That this fantasy of this bourgeois kind of settler on the prairie that can take care of their own health, that the second we get away from these fantasies and look at the real world, that the vast majority of the human population right now are in no conditions to even begin to take control of their own health. And to be honest, the very small segment of the population that can are not my audience. I think that very small privileged population, to the degree that they are willing to really look at the world around them, they're going to have to realize that soon even what seems possible to them now is not the case. But realistically, that picture of the individual who can completely care for their health in this way, who can do all the research, who can make sure that their food is coming from a reliable source, etc. Under today's conditions, that picture always has to have slaves somewhere off stage. It's not actually realistic that the material conditions exist. And where do your sewing pins come from? Where do your tools come from? Right? I mean, this is something that I think Molly Klein has actually made a point of in numerous cases, that this kind of petty bourgeois fantasy of the growing your own food as a response. Now, at the same time, there are useful survival tactics, as it were, that we can draw from this discourse, and there's useful things from being in conversation with people who are trying to work through these problems, not maliciously often, but within the ideological blinkers that have been provided to them by the society that they're in. So there are a lot of genuine people, even working class people, who have been heavily indoctrinated by these individualist capitalist fantasies, who think, okay, how do I solve this problem? And the only logic that even seems available to them, based on the ideological conditioning and propaganda, are these go it alone fantasies. But of course, realistically, I think the second one really contemplates all the things that we know are the real serious drivers of poor health and the conditions that would possibly allow us to overcome them. It has to be a collective political struggle, and it has to be. That's the only way to get anywhere near the conditions where we could be dealing with these issues.
I know you've brushed on it, Tom. I think it's to acknowledge the arm or the force of the pharmaceuticals industry's investment on manipulating the population by buying their products, which you mentioned here in your piece, and the importance of persuading people through advertisements, as they have done, like in Mexico, in Ireland, in some of the most poorest areas of the world and global, like Nestle has done with PepsiCo in Mexico, in my country, where they are trying to do this anti-hunger campaign and trying to give people formulas, baby formulas, in order to take care of this hunger issue that's happening in other countries. And instead of really promoting something as free and more natural and as better as it is for babies, right? Like just to be breastfed. And so I think if anyone remembers, like in the 70s, there was a scandal that it happened with Nestle and the baby formula, and how there was a boycott for it. And because they were using, I have it here, they were using ways to promote the baby formula through can't find it. I'll just remember here. They were trying to manipulate people and to promote it as much as possible through giving free samples, give them as gifts, and trying to give false information about it in order for it to be used and marketed for the capitalist gain. So I appreciate you mentioning it. I don't know if you want to say anything more about this, how much is spent on just the manipulation of facts, and also in relationship to what we've seen currently with the COVID vaccinations. I mean, I don't know anyone that could really talk about COVID and their stance of maybe being a doubter, maybe not a denier of anything, but just being, oh, I'm not too sure, without anyone harping on you. People, regular people, not doctors, because everyone was so brainwashed into buying into it, and that you couldn't talk about something alternative without being, pushed by your regular grandmother or pushed by your regular neighbor or etc. It was so pervasive.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I don't know. It's one of those shocking areas of profound cognitive dissonance, because everyone knows this, even as something as mainstream as John Oliver covered a few years ago, the fact that most of these pharmaceutical companies spend more on more on advertising than they do on research and development. And even that is, when you look into the terms, how much of this research and development should properly be understood as itself a form of marketing propaganda is another issue that I try to point to a bit in the essay. And as well, that people don't think critically about even what that marketing budget really means, both in the sense of the tremendous influence that, like I also point out in the paper, that in 2018, I think was when I looked at the study, all the major advertisers the largest advertiser for all the major cable news channels were selling some kind of medical product. And that means that they have a tremendous influence on what those news reports will say or not say, how they will frame things. So there are all these forms of both explicit and implicit bias. But there's also, your point just reminded me of another thing that Corbett actually reported on that was, I think, phenomenally revealing. A lot of people on the left are familiar with this initiative to try and gin up war support, and that did succeed in getting support for the first Gulf War. They had this young woman come and claim that the Iraqi soldiers came and hurled out some completely unbelievable amount of premature babies out of incubators. There's a great speech by Michael Parenti where he kind of says, what do they think Kuwait specialized in having premature babies, to even believe that they would have this many, collected there. But this story really did work, and that story was managed and planted by a PR company called Hill and Knowlton. Yeah, that same PR company was contracted by the WHO to manage their COVID-19 public messaging at the start of the so-called pandemic. Right. So in these instances, it's directly there. The information is available. The connections are clear. And it is just the tremendous weight of kind of, I think, indoctrination and ideology that somehow allows for them not to be taken up and integrated.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about, like Eduardo bringing up the propaganda campaign as just such a massive arm of this. But I was even thinking, like, I loved the Federici quote that you included. I'm like a huge Federici person. Her work has just been super impactful in terms of my understanding of Marxism and all kinds of stuff. But I was just thinking about the way that propaganda, like even prior to all of the technology and the sort of like male medical professional sort of rising to, the highest status. I was just thinking about the way that like the witch trials are such a great kind of embodiment of the propaganda like underpinnings, this idea that even before all of that shit, like they were able to brand, right? Like this idea of whether it was like the midwife or the natural healer, or like people who were practicing, mostly women who were practicing medicine or like science, like real science, right? We're talking like as early as like 14th, 15th, 16th century, like really robust understandings of anatomy and plant medicine, right? And like truly true medical, well, not medical care, but healthcare. And the way that propaganda campaign was so successful, such that like at a certain point, like they didn't need to kill every individual, like quote unquote witch who was threatening to this upcoming industry. They already had, like, the propaganda had already done that work for them, right? And it works like all the way through to present day, where now, like, yeah, if you make tinctures in your kitchen, like you're automatically marginalized as like, oh, you're not serious, you're whatever, hippie, witch, pick your pejorative. But I was just thinking about, like, I think a lot of times we think of the propaganda as like part of this like modern, it's the advertisements and, selling pills, right? But I think it really precedes all of that, like industrial revolution, enlightenment era.
Yeah, and I think that just highlights again just how much this is a question of power and class, and how that's lost. That in that instance, that vast body of incredibly effective, useful medical knowledge, right, from the position of the ruling class who had this problem of how to force through enclosure and how to break the back of peasant resistance. And one of the most effective ways of doing that was offering some relatively preferential position to men within the enclosed the society subject to enclosure. And you had this problem that this incredibly useful and effective body of knowledge was in the hands of women and made them more powerful, gave them control over their own reproduction, and so made it harder to dominate them. And so that whole body of knowledge was broken and destroyed, and replaced with much worse medical knowledge, but medical knowledge that was more conducive to the political necessities and aims of the ruling class.
Yeah, totally. And I think, like, just back to your earlier point of like, it initially was more about, I mean, and still is more about like business and industry than it ever was based on like science, like real health. I mean, they were able to sort of invent, whether it was like surgical tools or like the licensing campaign, right? To where like suddenly if you didn't have a license, you were criminalized if you were practicing medicine.
So I very much agree with the notion of seeing more deeply this notion of propaganda, and to think of it as just as commercialism or advertisement, or even just to think of it as a modern concept as opposed to something that has existed, that we've existed in class divided society where a minority of people rule, and they have always used ideas to control the population, and they're definitely doing it now, and they did it then. But I want to add another layer that you did in the reading that you introduced when Silvia Federici talks about this process of separation of the spirit from the body, that she talks about in that quote. Because what's so useful for me about it is we talk about transhumanism, and transhumanism is kind of separating spirit from body, but this approach has been very important for capitalism, of separating body and soul, if you will. Even if body and spirit, mental labor and manual labor kind of separations, alienation has been central to how capitalism has worked to control. And I do want to extend that to this quote that you cited from Silvia Federici. She talks about it as mechanical philosophy. She goes, in mechanical philosophy, we perceive a new bourgeois spirit that calculates, classifies, makes distinction, and degrades the body only to rationalize its faculties, aiming not just at intensifying its subjugation, but at maximizing social utility. And she goes on further, to pose the body as mechanical matter, void of any intrinsic teleology, was to make intelligible the possibility of subordinating it to a work process that increasingly relied on uniform and predictable forms of behavior. Once its devices were constructed and it was itself reduced to a tool, the body could be opened to an invite manipulation of its power and possibility. The quote goes on further, but I just feel like that's like even that is like a layer in which we're approaching that gets to issues of germ theory, the notion of treating sickness versus treating sick, and that also I do think gets us to the modern hospital system that developed. And I think we are not invited to think that way about our society. And I think that quote, and you putting that quote in your reading, really just opened my eyes to just how deep, if you will, the propaganda goes in. It gets into just the way we even see the world at all.
Yeah, I think, and I think it's indicative of also the nature of the relationship to the ruling class to ideological production more generally. The ruling class produces nothing really, even ideas in some sense. Yeah, that they exploit the ideas that are freely and spontaneously generated by the whole human community under certain conditions. And I think in those, that's why these ideas are sites of struggle. And I think it's just fascinating to think about the fact, without going down a tangent, but already while this ideological trend was happening, there was the reactionary, mystifying responses to it from the kind of right. I think we could say, going back to one of the points we discussed last time about the continuity or meaningfulness of thinking about a left category. But I think if you think of the poetry of William Blake in particular as this tremendous, what I think is self-evidently left-wing response to this process of the mechanization and the tearing away the spirit from the body, but as much as a kind of prophetic character, and Blake mystifies in his own way, obviously self-consciously, we can recognize that there is more in what is classed as religion or the obscure than simply this materialist mechanism. And there's a bad tendency, I suppose, amongst our comrades to, again, just simply to identify with the crudest mechanism by positioning it against that the binary here is between a mechanism or a organic holism, rather than something more dialectical that would be more appropriate to the question.
I guess we're in this discussion. This part of this discussion is about medical society, how it has been rearranged by, some would say, thanks to the healthcare system and then its technological and scientific advances. You argue that this is obviously, like here, this is what the consequences of that, but some would say that there are positive consequences, such as eradicating polio, or making sure that people would have better hygienic habits and preventative measures to diseases and germs and sicknesses. These are things that people clearly state out that they would showed that just even measures like these at a grand scale in society, such as in England, there were a lot of people didn't have running toilets, right? There wasn't a sewer system. So people used to just litter out or defecated out onto the street. I remember being in London, and that was one of the things that I read about, even in Edinburgh. So these are things that when doctors would go into poor neighborhoods, or what would now be considered, I guess, ghettos or areas where they were prevalent, these unsanitary practices, then people wondered why they would get sick. But it wasn't until doctors would find understandings that, oh my goodness, people are not keeping distance away from, for example, fecal matter, or they're not taking on, they're not taking care of, or not doing campaigns in order to take care of the sick with medicines that were benefiting the poor. What would you say then to those advances and to those reasons why we need to have this a healthcare system that maintains a healthy society. Does that make sense? I don't know if I posed my question. Yeah.
No, yeah, I think again, it's kind of helpful almost to reiterate that my position is, as a Marxist, as a leftist, pro-enlightenment and pro-science, I think, and pro-medical care that is properly conducted and well-grounded. I think the problem here, and even, I mean, with those positions, we have to unpack, and it is to some degree the fault of those that fight with us on the other side of the more kind of flippant or overgeneralizing critiques of medical care more broadly or science more broadly, that make it understandable that people think we're throwing out the baby with the bathwater, as it were here. But of course, the class struggle pervades the society, right? And one of the ways in which capitalism constituted itself was by providing lots of useful commodities and products and things. Capitalism emerged out of a historical conjuncture where there was a group of people who could gain power via exploiting labor and providing useful commodities, right, and not by any other way, right? The people who became capitalism and foisted capitalism on the earth would have rather have been aristocrats, but that wasn't an option. And so they gained power and constituted themselves as a class through this avenue, which generated capitalism, which was also a tremendous engine of productivity, and also did massively spur the emergence of science. So I wouldn't at all uncritically or throw out all of the wonderful benefits, right, that have been extracted or made possible by capitalist relations. I don't think we have to negate those. And the same goes even for medical science, right? There are these, I think, paradoxes or constraints. As we noted, of course, the ruling class was never interested in the maximal health of their workers, but they were interested in a certain level of health, right? Certainly enough, and even a lot of tropical medicine, right, emerged out of the demands for both making sure that your soldiers, mercenaries, overseers could survive, right, and to exploit the labor. So there are always these countervailing tendencies, and also there are the demands of the population. So there are certainly, I think I want to make absolutely clear, in case that's not from the article, tremendous gains that have been produced by modern medical science. But an awful lot of those, to the degree that medical science has produced gains, it has been in response to the demands or the exertions of the masses, generally speaking. And also, insofar as we've had broader, I think, beneficial responses to public health demands, that has also been a response to popular power. And one of the complicated things that I try to accommodate in the essay, that again I think is hard to make on its own case, and it's useful to read my prior essay, not to demand endless footnotes or whatever to my arguments, but that, for instance, social democracy in the West, which I take as something that was possible principally because of the deeper successes or more profound successes of the working class in establishing socialist and also progressive anti-colonialist states that forced that compromise with the domestic working classes, did create all these conditions in which you had an empowered, educated population who could demand and had the resources, right, to some degree scrutinize the healthcare that was provided for them. So I think our assessment of these things has to be much more fine, detailed, and dialectical to see that all these things are a site of struggle. Now, on the same time, though, wherever possible, right, the hegemonic ideological institutions of the ruling class are always going to favor, perpetuate, and select those presentations of the reality which militate against our empowerment as workers, right, or as the masses in generally. So one of the core arguments of this whole essay is that the labor struggle against capitalism, which took the form domestically of social democracy and the trade union struggle, and in other places, and these can't be separated, right? The struggle for socialism, etc., did win real games, right? That there was a point of the establishment of capitalism produced these conditions that was itself complicated, that tore people from a lot of natural conditions, produced all sorts of circumstances in which there were new or different forms of ill health. Piecing together even a comprehensive picture of health over the course of these different phases is very complicated, I think, and not at all a simplistic thing to do. But particularly, right, I think we can say that the massive reduction in illness from these major, especially infectious diseases, whether we agree that all of them are infectious or not, or that infectious is the best way to understand them, right? Both bacterial and virological, there is this massive reduction over the period that is roughly consonant with the progressive establishment of the welfare state and the increasing living standards of workers in the places where these diseases go away. And my argument is that capitalism or capitalist institutions have tended to favor the interpretation of that phenomenon, which views it as a gift from ruling class science. And so, in particular, this idea that it is vaccines or pharmaceuticals that produce these gains in health, when really there's very compelling evidence, as is presented in particular in part 3 of this essay, that a huge portion of those gains, at minimum, can be accounted for much more directly by the better living standards. And above all, I mean, one of the major things is simple increase in nutrition. It's a great point that Levantin makes in Biology as Ideology, referring to studies in Brazil where the life expectancy of infants goes up and down with the minimum wage. Often it is that direct, that if people can adequately feed themselves and their children, they have better health. If they can provide not to eat toxic substances that are substitutes for adequate food, then they have better health. There are other aspects of health, absolutely, and we can't throw them out. But I think the major argument of this essay is that the much more important determinants, which, if they were clearly and lucidly understood, would show the absolute decisive importance of politics and the class struggle, are constantly obscured in favor of representations of the reality, which try to invert it or place it in a way more conducive to the interest of the rulers.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of tells you all you need to know, right? That like why does the WHO and the Gates Foundation and I mean the United States government push for vaccines and pharma over prioritizing, you know, if we're looking at like international scale, increased sanitation, eradication of malnutrition, eradication of poverty, really, in wherever. I mean, Africa or like Flint, Michigan or San Francisco, right? Like clean water and healthy food would go a lot farther based on science, but it's not in their class interest to do that.
Yeah, and if I could just note, just because it's something that I plan to get into in part 4, but haven't spoken of in these earlier essays as much, but Jacob Levitch in particular has done incredible research on how the Gates Foundation in particular systematically turns public health in third world countries away from the straightforward popular democratic means, right? Clean water, empowerment of the population, control over their own food supplies, to gutting these public budgets that are anywhere near popular control and turning, ripping whatever blood can be taken from that stone of these third world health budgets into useless pharmaceuticals, often experimental pharmaceuticals forced on the populations. And even if you believed in their claims, you'd still have to the only way to interpret that approach is that At best, they want circumstances in which the working class can live in squalor with essentially inadequate, if you can even call it food, and still manage to be healthy enough to work.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other, I don't know if it was in part 2 or part 3 where you showed that graph. Was it measles or tuberculosis?
I think it is measles, but Levantin also refers to tuberculosis
Yeah,
as having jumped up.
where you basically show that graph that really shows that the likelihood of young people, I think people below the age of 15, dying from measles goes down and down and down and down and down. And then when it gets to the very bottom, the virus that causes measles is discovered. That's not even the point at which the vaccine, so-called vaccine, which eliminates it, which is supposed to be, which is accredited for eliminating measles, is that the so-called virus that supposedly created this problem is discovered that at the time the thing is eliminated, and yet it's attributed, the solution to this problem is attributed to ruling class miracle procedures. That in and of themselves isn't actually even made by the ruling class, but they claim the scientific germ theory that produced that result, or that diagnosed the problem, and then we produce this thing called a vaccine that then gives us a solution when the thing has actually already been solved. And then to say, so it does two things. It like you said, it credits the rulers with the solution, and then simultaneously obscures the actual actions of workers to improve their living conditions through struggle. I mean, you can draw a through line from them to the witches, who were so-called witches, women who had their own solutions for their health, to say, no, you have nothing to do with that solution. And that's the same way, again, I really do believe that the best way to understand how our medical industry is operated is just look at what has happened at COVID this whole time. Anyone who put forward vitamin D or any sort of idea for how to solve this was literally criminalized. Like, people, there was a website, I remember that, a time when websites that were pushing for vitamin D solutions to the problems people were experiencing, health problems that people were experiencing that were called COVID. When vitamin D was put up, those websites were being shut down, and doctors who prescribed that who talked about that were fined, or at least were going to be threatened with a fine. And that's just one area, and that's just vitamin D. There are probably, I know there are other things people were talking about doing, and in all cases, that was all pushed aside. Let alone the idea that your body itself may have a response that would be able to solve it. No, the vaccine has to come in. I mean, we know there are reasons for that. We can talk about QR codes in the digital world and the fourth industrial revolution, but that experience was not just some sort of exaggerated experience. That was an exposure of what we have been living in. I was born into that, and it existed well before me, and it's been around for quite some time. That sort of way our medical industry has separated our own accomplishments from reality, and then attributed all those accomplishments to themselves.
Yeah, and I would just add, especially earlier on in the kind of earlier iteration, as I kind of present in the essay, also very useful for obscuring real causes of harms, to make people not appreciate the significance of malnutrition, and I think in particular to make people not appreciate the importance of toxic, poisoning exposure to all sorts of pollutants. Concern about has now become somehow like a right-wing fringe issue, to think that there are toxins in our environment, ludicrously. I think in particular with polio, the tremendous evidence that this was something that had much more to do with various pesticides, exposure to these toxic things, that then in the case of polio was quite consciously, I think there's tremendous evidence, consciously covered up with the rollout of a vaccine and a coordinated program to, along with Silent Spring, to do this kind of controlled hangout about the dangers that came from DDT in particular. And I think one of the significant things, though, that has occurred is that for a long time, this picture of health has been a useful one for the capitalists to also wash their hands of harms and to say that it's these circulating invaders, right? Whereas the really significant shift that began with AIDS and really culminated with COVID-19 has been the ruling class has actually transferred its position within this hall of mirrors that it's constructed around health. And whereas they previously said society is not responsible for these dangers to health that come from these, circulating little viral mercenaries that are floating around. Now, even more sinisterly, they have taken on for themselves the responsibility that they say, oh, we do have the right and the obligation. It's just like R2P, the right to protect this development in international law, the expression of ultimate, kind of dictatorial posture towards undoing the previous consensus about national sovereignty. So too with human bodies, that with this COVID-19 approach to health, the ruling class insists that they are responsible now for the viruses circulating in our body and can do whatever they need to, as they present, to control that circulation.
And can I add one more modern story that just completely highlights this dynamic you're talking about? This was something I actually posted on Facebook and sent to my, Brandy. She's in Hawaii right now, and my folks and my brother. It's an article by Yahoo whose title is, let's see, what's the title? Since COVID, more young people are dying of heart attacks. Here's what we know. And then if you go down to the meat of the article, since the COVID-19 pandemic began, heart attack deaths across all age groups have become more common in the United States, according to a September 22 study by Cedars-Sinai Hospital in Los Angeles. And they just absolutely no mention of the vaccine. They even go as far as saying heart attacks are connected to myocarditis in the article. No mention of the vaccines, no mention of these shots, these mRNA shots. And they're just going on and being like, well, it looks like COVID might have looks like some long-term effect of COVID seems to be all these young people a growing risk of heart attacks. Go figure. I mean, it literally, I'm watching a return of all the history you're describing about all these things, like literally in front of my face.
Yeah, and I think too, that article, for example, is shocking to us, and just like the blatancy of whatever the puppet show, right? But to a lot of people, it's not, right? And I think, this series definitely highlights like some of the material ways in which, like, how can people be expected to see through this propaganda given what they're fed, like literally from birth? Like we had a great little moment in one of my classes the other week because we just read Silent Spring in my ecofeminist lit class, and we were watching some of the old footage of it was literally like, children just being hosed down with DDT under the assumption that this was going to protect them from polio. And my students, they were like, even though they had read the book, I think the images of it were just so shocking to them that they were like, oh my God, like I can't believe that people believed this. And then one of them sort of piped up and said, like, oh, like, kind of makes me wonder, like, what we're going to be saying about this era, like what practices are going to be viewed in that way that we're all participating in. And I was like, yeah.
And I want to add one complication, because I had the same response that I sent this to my mom and my brother and Brandy and Heather, my sister-in-law, with that same sense of despair of like, oh my God. And my mom pointed out, and you can look at this article, and maybe I'll post it, that there's 4,800 comments. And to a person, everyone's being like, what the hell are you talking about? And the top comment on the thing is basically a person who said, not only did I not get nailed with COVID, and I'm never going to get near that shot, but they basically talk about, let me see if I can find it. I don't have anything against being against tested, proven vaccines, but when I served and they were in the army, I was administered the experimental anthrax vaccine, and years later ended up with cancer, and which was linked directly to the experimental anthrax vaccine. So, like, I don't even know what to make of that. To like this massive outpouring of letters of people going like, "Fuck you." Tom, I'd like you to kind of speak to both of these things because I have despair about it, and I don't know what to yet to make about also the kind of these responses that are in the letters, and it's overwhelming in some ways.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point because I think, obviously the case with the ruling class, to use a very simplistic analogy, but that often comes to my mind, is they're extremely small, right? And there's a hell of a lot more of us than the people who want to rule us, and so they can never force their will directly. The only way that they can actually achieve, especially and even more so without concentrated the current ruling classes, is by using the forces that we generate against us. I mean, the ruling class is always using jujitsu, right? They can't directly carry forward their interest, and so almost always in the most effective programs of the ruling class, we see inverted expressions of our own power or our own desire or our own interest, just as the way that Marx so eloquently said that religion, right, was this inversion of man's real creative powers turned into something which stood over him and dominated him. And so we talked about that to some degree with virology, but I also think it's significant with one of the most concerning things that we have to be preoccupied in our specific position and conjuncture is the controlled opposition that the ruling class installs in between all of us that are potentially or actively resisting and those other people who are potentially and actively resisting. And so even, we were talking before about health, and I was thinking of this Malhotra character who has been recently circulated as the reasonable, glossy face of opposition. And this is a guy who has for a long time been criticizing statins and a lot of the garbage science around heart disease, with the response that we need to tax sugar and fatty foods and all these things, and put more carceral or shackles around these things to punish working people who have no option. Or we think of these people like Malone, all these fraudulent characters that are put at the top of the opposition. And one of the major things that these people tend to drive is this idea of the sheeple. This is one of the most prevalent. I think you can always kind of identify either a controlled opposition or someone who has been goaled absolutely by them. By this idea that the problem is, that the majority are stupid sheeple that fell for all this, and that it's just we, this clever little few. The vast, vast majority of the global population has had nothing to do with this program. Right? Most of humanity has put tremendous opposition to these vaccines. The whole point of all these legal, quasi-legal mechanisms that they tried to come to force these vaccines and these measures upon people necessarily imply, right? They would have liked to do it by less aggressive means, but it was because the population resisted. People are tremendously skeptical. I think you talk to the vast majority of people about why the concessions they've made to this, and it's some combination, even there, of their goodwill being misdirected and by the terror that was by force imposed, but this whole idea that we're amidst these stupid sheeple has nothing to do with the real world in which we live, and is constantly hammered into us precisely by those people who would like to make sure that majority, that vast majority, does not actually carry forth its will.
So, Tom, as we're wrapping up here, there are areas in this piece of yours that I think that we should just conclude with. Can you just maybe mention a piece of it that you would like to further discuss before we wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, I think just one of the kind of linchpin arguments of the essay, and I think one of the most important, is stepping back really at a very structural level and looking at the epistemic conditions that we're in terms of evaluating the medical and scientific information that's produced, and assessing how we should, what our default or a priori approach to that should be. And one of the significant arguments that I rely on the essay comes in particular from this text, Medical Nihilism by Jacob Stiganga, which is a very formal kind of academic philosophy work, and is not at all comes to the same conclusions as myself. He's very reformist, I think very bourgeois perspective, but he nonetheless makes a really compelling argument that essentially when you step back and you assess this whole edifice and you look at the innumerable sources of bias that are flowing into the ultimate results that come. So when we start from the fact that the vast majority of research that's undertaken in our society, right, is happening either directly by the institutions that seek to profit from some product that comes as a result of it, and that's the vast majority, directly by the profit-seeking corporations, overwhelmingly again, criminal profit-seeking corporations, which seek to produce something and whose only incentive is getting something on the market that people will buy. Yeah, and their disincentives are being regulated, right, or being sued against these products. And we assess how likely, how effective are the mechanisms for imposing those disincentives. When we consider the fact that the other research being conducted is being conducted in either public institutions or research universities, which are themselves so intimately interlinked with those private corporations that they really can't be treated as independent at all anymore. Yeah, and so this is one of the pillars of the argument, that this is where the information, the research is being produced. Then we consider the fact that the means in which the research is being done, right, we have the supposed hierarchy from observational studies at the bottom all the way up to randomized control trials to meta-analyses. But Stiganga makes a tremendously compelling argument, I think, that on every level there is tremendous malleability, right? Both for unconscious bias, right? So even under conditions where we assume goodwill for all participants, but the simple natural forces of confirmation bias and implicit incentives, so people want to find a certain result, are sufficient to induce massive skew into the system. And he goes through, I think, quite meticulously showing that these are just as much the case at the level of randomized control trials, at the meta-analysis. And one of the really effective arguments he makes in favor of that is that an important aspect of meta-analysis are tools for evaluating studies lower on the hierarchy. But he shows that meta-analyses of those qualitative assessment tools, so the tools that exist for assessing lower on the hierarchy studies, have very little evidence of consistency. So different people applying the same quality assessment mechanisms come up with different results, and across the difference, so there's a number of different quality assessment mechanisms, and they tend to produce wildly different results when you put the studies through them. So the hierarchy is not actually genuine. So the things at the top of the hierarchy are not necessarily better. And every level, there's lots of areas for skew, and the people engaged in it are massively inclined towards skewing it, right? So these factors are at play. Then you consider the fact that the grand kind of golden linchpin from the perspective of MAIMS supporters and the legitimate ideology is that the thing that is checking this all, if it's not the regulatory institutions or the beautiful goodwill of the scientists involved, who have all these massive financial incentives, is the peer review system. But every serious analysis of the peer review system shows that it's profoundly flawed. And there's actually remarkable evidence cited in the paper. There's even more in Stegenga, and as well in Virus Mania also has a lot of this information about people involved at the highest levels of some of the most esteemed journals, right? High-level editors commenting about how useless, how inadequate the mechanisms of peer review are. And then there are objective studies, the most famous, of course, John Ioannidis's, I think it was 2005 study, that most published research findings are false. Yeah, that they cannot be reproduced. And something that ties back to what we discussed in the prior program was that with the increasing technical complexity of the scientific enterprise, even if you wanted to reproduce these studies, it becomes difficult. And one of the really significant factors is that there's a huge, massive price barrier that most of the significant science, right, and the basis of these studies is occurring under conditions in which there has to be a truly unfathomable prior investment, right? So there's no way that either independent organizations or even research institutions on the budget of third world countries, or even middle income countries, could possibly have the means to be producing the circumstances to even check this work, even if they wanted to. So there's a factor there that I think is often underappreciated, that the sheer expensiveness of the technology is a useful way on a very crude level of excluding any reproduction or verification of the science that's going on. Meanwhile, the peer review is occurring by the peers, right, are people who are going through these tightly controlled and disciplined institutions. And I think one of the remarkable facts I cited in the paper, this one was from Virus Mania. I can't remember if it was the British Medical Journal, BMJ, or New England Journal of Medicine. One of them had to change their policies that people making more than 10,000 in the concerned field could not be peer reviewed, because there was no one to be found who was making less than 10,000, right? And we do have studies showing that financial interest do affect the outcome of regulatory reviews, right? We assume the same must be the case of peer reviews, and yet that is not being used as a barrier to participation in the peer review process. So throughout this whole mechanism, we have these tremendous incentives and tendencies towards bias. On the other hand, I think perhaps the most significant fact that Stegenga highlights is that the most significant fact about research today is that the vast majority of it is not published. And so the research that we see is an exceedingly small fragment of the real research done. And every factor that plays into what is the part of that fragment and what isn't is that the fragment we see is massively disproportionately skewed to be the fragment which shows positive effect for pharmaceutical products or medical inventions more generally, and which doesn't show negative effects. And most of the research which shows either of those things simply isn't published. And although there are reformist effects to modulate this, and there have been some improvements in some ways, on the whole, the apparatus is clearly so massively skewed in favor of this that he makes the very compelling argument that our confidence a priori must be extremely low in the outcomes, the information produced by this edifice.
I mean, I think that's incredibly relevant, incredibly important, how much you emphasized Stegenga's conclusion of this, because as you noted in your piece, there's like most of the people in the FDA and all the people who are regulatory and all the hierarchy of filtering through an approval piece has a conflict of interest. You've stated, and everyone is going to have some bias, as you mentioned as well. I mean, we are still using to this day. I was listening to a podcast by Reveal News, to this day, we're still using commonly used calculators that are leading Black and Latina women to have C-sections more than white women. And this is because of the legacy of J. Marion Sims, the father of modern gynecology, who experimented on enslaved women in the 1840s. And this calculator today is still being used. And it's notable as an institutional racism, where most Black women are getting C-sections because of this mode of measurement. So the instruments, the measurements, the legacy from the past, the conflict of interests, the biases that we have, whether economic or racist, these are embedded into this complex, into this big pharma or the medical complex, right? So it's as you've noted here, prevailing and pervasive. It's in every structural in our institution of what makes up the medical industrial complex. So it's thank you, appreciate that you bringing that up. I'm not. I don't know how anyone could naively just assume that everything is for our own good or it's in our good. And as you also brought up about COVID, what was highlighted wasn't how 90%. You didn't state this, but you talked about the positive effects of the vaccine instead of the negative effects. And what also wasn't brought up during this 3-year era was how 90% of the people of the population were recovering from COVID before the jabs, and how less than 2% of here in the USA were being affected gravely, but everyone else was being recovered. But it was just that small number that was being highlighted and that was being emphasized and that was being used to target for to move the masses to their narrative, this global narrative on COVID.
Tom, do you want to respond to that? Because I was going to actually add some of my own experiences in science that reflected some of the stuff you're talking about, but I want to see if you want to respond to what Eduardo's saying.
Yeah, I'd be very interested to hear that. I would just make the small point that I think, interestingly, again, the COVID experience has helped at least those of us who are somewhat skeptical understand these deeper phenomenon in understanding what is a kind of, I think, even statistics 101 phenomenon that a lot of the general population doesn't understand about something like testing, where even if you have an extremely good test, if you're, with a high level of accuracy, if you are applying it in a population in which the disease is not very prevalent or non-existent, then even a highly accurate test, most of the positives will be false positives. And I think that's a helpful analogy for people to understand that people will read a scientific study that's in a peer-reviewed journal that will be even very well done, right? So well-executed, randomized controlled trial, you imagine all the conditions are such as to produce good results that you should trust. And if you treated that publication in isolation, you would naively think that that's good information. But once you understand that ostensibly positive result from a good trial is one of thousands of unpublished comparable experiments, then you realize that in the same way that you could run a good test over and over and still get a false positive, you can do a well-designed experiment over and over until you get the result that you want. And there's a huge bias, even on a cynical but not completely malicious level, that is often underappreciated, that pharmaceutical, and this is one of the deeper rationalities of capitalist science or science done for intelligent purposes more generally, that if a pharmaceutical company is investigating a product and they find a harm or they find an inefficacy, even if they don't want to sell that product themselves, they have a bias not to publish it because they have a financial incentive in their competitor wasting resources on the same useless experiment. So what is a structural capitalist inefficiency on a broad scale under these conditions translates into a massive bias towards inaccurate positive results. Because if you imagine a scenario in which, over these many different arms of these pharmaceutical companies, which maybe are not even interacting with each other, this same product goes through good experiments, let's even assume good experiments, 1,000 times, and among one of those arms, they find the positive results they want and are sufficient to get it onto market. All those other arms and all those different pharmaceutical companies or branches thereof didn't publish it because they were hoping that the other, 98,000 competitors wasted those resources. But that amounts again to this huge pool that's black, that's unseen to us. And that means that what we see cannot be assessed as such. Right? But Andy, I'm really interested to hear your broader extrapolations.
What happened at Johns Hopkins, Andy?
Well, this actually starts really in some ways with my post, and this isn't really broader, but more like a specific example of how I see this. And it's probably just all I'm repeating is why I never read. I read part of Unitas's article on why most things are false, like that most publications are false, but I didn't get fully through it. Now I want to go back and reread the whole thing, but it really just highlights in an area where I don't actually, I did not feel like directly the financial incentive to essentially do a kind of fraud. I want to say how this fraud played out in publications that I was part of. It was work done at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute in St. Louis after I got my undergrad degree, and I was thinking about getting into the biomedical field. And we were doing a study on an EGF receptor, epidermal growth factor, and trying to figure out signal transduction. Like, how does, when the epidermal growth factor binds the receptor, with the theory is a signal gets transduced to get the cell to do something in response to the factor, this hormone that's being applied. Quiet, Gizmo. And we had an early result that suggested that the untreated epidermal growth factor was less phosphorylated than the treated growth factor. So we said, oh, phosphorylation, this phosphate group adding onto the receptor, may be the basis for signal transduction. So we had that preliminary result. It existed. And from there, it takes a year to 2 years to then publish evidence of that this phosphorylation where we could produce publish an article that says, oh yeah, we've shown that this phosphorylation is a result, or is one of the ways the signal gets transduced. Well, I remember doing experiment after experiment after experiment, like at least maybe 2 experiments a week. And they were like, wait, that didn't show this result. So let's what did we do wrong in that experiment? How do we adjust the experiment to get a different outcome? Like we were just saying, we kept everything that didn't show the initial thesis we had. We thought there was an experimental problem. So what we were doing was fine tuning the experiment to then produce a series of results that you could piece together and say, here we publish it, and here's our evidence. Because the publication process, publish or perish, was one where if you published experiments that were contrary to your result, then it wouldn't see the light of day, because clearly it was wrong. And it's like, wait a second. What should have been happening is we actually should have been publishing almost every 2 months, really, basically publishing, this is our theory, but here's the countervailing things. But we thought that experiment was wrong because we did this. You'd actually have to put all that stuff you're doing out there so people could evaluate it. It's like, what's that kind of open space science almost, where you're basically showing everything, and the publishing. The way you could publish was, you had to make a credible case, and a credible case meant you had to really curate this. You had to go through this curating process. Your own self-curating process was just really an internal lying process to give it to these peer review people. And secondly, I want to say that I remember being the peer reviews people being talked about and it's something that you really wanted to get to. And the people who were asked to be peer reviewers were people who themselves had proven that they could do credible science. And these are people who essentially built kind of feudal empires through this very same process. And anybody who was going to actually put something forward that was a theory that might actually undermine the edifices under which these people had been built, there's no way they're going to be let in. Like, so any real science that might be alternative science would have no way of getting through that edifice of a peer review process built essentially of kings and queens who had built their empires out of this very same process. So you don't even have to put the financial and incentive into there, which clearly exists as well. But no one wants their own house of cards to fall by some clown who's got a different idea about how this whole thing goes that could just blow your whole thing down, and then it goes down like the Twin Towers. So like, that's just some of the experiences I remember feeling and thinking. And like, I remember doing all these different experiments going like, I'm doing these experiments, but the results are going nowhere. They're like, literally, they're hidden except for in our lab. And there did seem something wrong about that, but that was definitely something. And I think that happens lab after lab after lab. And no one publishes in 3 months. Everyone publishes after a year and a half, 2, if you're lucky sometimes. So what's going on in that year? You're not just doing 2 experiments, 3 experiments. You're doing experiment after experiment after experiment and doing this curating process that produces this outcome that you can then sell to the reviewers as, here is something that you can believe.
Just to add on really briefly, I'm not in the sciences, but I have been through peer review publications in the humanities. And I mean, just to, like, obviously it doesn't directly affect the medical industrial complex in the same way as like actual scientific studies, but the whole structure is exactly the same. And it's, working in a public university, it's kind of shocking to me, like how hard they push the sort of peer review, like in all disciplines, in any standard English class, it's like, you better be writing a paper and you better check that little box on the database, right, of like peer review, because you have to include X number of peer reviewed studies because that is the gold standard. And there's absolutely no analysis or even discussion usually. Well, we do discuss in my class, but about like what does it even mean? It's just like you give the kids a list, like, here's unreliable types of sources, and then here's reliable, and then here's peer review, which is at the top, right? And so you even have these students who, a lot of them are not going to necessarily be going, staying in academia or like going into the medical field or, anything like that. Like, they might end up having working class jobs, but they still, they've had this idea of peer review as like this special, thing at the top of the hierarchy, like just drilled into them. It's pretty wild. And yeah, I mean, my experience of like publishing in academia myself too is just like, if you're sort of reinforcing the popular ideas of the academic culture at that moment, it's basically a circle jerk, the whole process of peer review. And then if you're threatening that discourse, good luck getting published, and good luck even staying in academia, because it's the same thing, publish or perish. Especially at the beginning of your career, like kind of where I am right now, where it's like there's so much pressure, because like if you don't keep publishing, you're not going to be able to stick it out in the field.
Yeah, and I just think there's another very significant point that they make in Virus Mania, where they refer to a text that's on all these areas of serious mistakes and fraud in the sciences, and they note that none of these were caught by peer review. And the actual track record of peer review on excluding the things it's supposed to exclude, poor science or poor research, is not particularly compelling, but it is clearly a very effective institution at indoctrination and exclusion.
I appreciate the last paragraph, of course, which was about class struggle, and I hope that we will speak further on that. That is the way to go. That is the conclusion that is being drawn from Tom's written piece here.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to ask, what is revolution going to look like in your mind? But I don't know if we have time for that question, because it's a big one.
And I want to note that I do have some differences that I'd hope to get into with Tom. Like, we can talk about it in terms of the way, the characterization of the go your own way, the full critique of it. Like, there is a way that I think the go your own way thing is going to be necessary at this time, while it will not solve the problem. And that part I agree with. So that's just for a later day.
Yeah. Well, on the following episodes. Tom?
Yeah, I think there's more than to be discussed clearly than we could manage. It was ambitious, I suppose, to try and get it done in two.
Oh, and we again, I do want to mention, we didn't talk about the important criticism that you raised in this article, in not just the field of in the medical field as it relates to the process of having, making babies and the reproduction process, because that's been coming up as a growing theme and on our show. I know we're going to be doing some future episodes that get in specifically to that, and I think the fact that you touched on that in your article is really important.
Well, we look forward to part 3, Tom. It's something I'm constantly now, as I read, like, oh my goodness, well, we're going to get to it, and we're going to see how long it takes from here until next time. These Saturday mornings with you. Waking up. This is not going to be the episode, but like, it's a struggle. It's a struggle.
Well, I'll just say that people may want to hear part 3. It might be a little while, folks. I'm just going to tell you that. So just bear with us.
As Marx himself said, Eduardo, that there's no royal road to science, and only him who is willing to brave his daunting climbs can gain his luminous summits. So I appreciate your waking up to discuss.
I do.
Climbs.
If you always want to do an episode at 4 a.m. or 2 a.m. when I'm about to sleep, we can always do that. I'm not sure if the rest of the crew wants to do that.
Eduardo, when are you going to grow up? You live like a graduate student or an undergrad.
He lives like a writer.
Yeah, right. That's true. That's right. Okay.
I spend time here in front of the screen, then I go to the garden at around 3 a.m. and then I come back inside.
Garden at 3 a.m.
Oh, I don't have time during the day. All right, here we go. Well, thank you, Tom. That does it for this week's episode. We appreciate having Tom on this week's episode. Tom Mohr's work can be found in the MagMa, the organ of the
Netzwerk Linker Widerstand,
of which Freie Linke Zukunft is a part of. The MagMa publishes chiefly in German, which is a small but expanding English section of both original work and material translated from German for an English-speaking audience. English submissions for publication in the MagMa are welcome for consideration. Those interested in the political orientation of the Freie Linke Zukunft can also find its flyers. Please contact Mohr with any comments, criticism, or questions at t.mohr, mohr.3@pm.me. And we'll link in the episode notes to your essay on virology as ideology. What's Left is a weekly political podcast channel challenging the mainstream left. We post information about our topics and our guests in the episode notes wherever you found this episode or on our blog at what'sleftpodcast.com. You can also find past episodes to this podcast channel there and connect with us. I remind folks, if you like anything you have heard here, please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications to any of our platforms on Spotify, iTunes Podcast, Stitcher, Google Play, BitChute, Odyssey, YouTube, or Rumble. And you can find any of those links to our blog and to those platforms and the episode notes where we found this podcast, wherever you found this episode. If you would like to give us feedback about something you've heard or suggest something for us to cover, contact us through our blog, such as Jeff did with Tom's essay piece. Thank you very much, Jeff. I'm Eduardo with co-host Jessica and Andy Lipson. We'll see you all next time. Thank you. Ciao.